Hello, Ajit. Welcome to AI Talks. It's lovely to have you here. I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you. Particularly over the last few months, the work that I've been following, that you've been doing in the whole education reimagination in the metaverse, looking at, some of the exploratory work that you're doing with AI and the space. And I guess most recently, what has really interested me is, your vision about democratizing the education of AI. And I'd love to hear a lot more about all of these topics. But let me start by going right to the beginning, rewind a little bit. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about, your background and where you were born, where you were raised, your journey into the whole, digital and technology space, and how it's been over the last couple of decades. So, yeah,
Sure,
over to you.
sure. Thank you, Namrita, and great to be here. And thank you for inviting me. And I guess the main thing for me is sort of when we talk about how I started, and I often try to talk to people about their career, as you know, because of the work I do at Oxford and in general. And I feel that my career is very unorthodox, meaning that if you come from India, as we both do, we know that everybody kind of does an engineering degree or a commerce degree or an arts degree, and then they have a certain trajectory mapped in their life. Yes, so they sort of do something, they study, they join a large company, they move through the ladders, they become a VP of something, and then kind of presumably move on from there. My career wasn't like that at all, and that's the thing is, I think that I tried to fit into that structure, but it somehow didn't work for me. What worked for me was a little bit sort of combining different things, and it took me much later in my life to realize that that really is what I'm good at, sort of combining or understanding the synergies between different things and seeing something which perhaps people do not typically see. And in my case, realistically, it was actually a combination of academia and entrepreneurship in a way. So that's really the key to what I do, because I was a consultant. I was a fairly successful consultant before I joined, and I was in telecoms. I was moderately successful with that, partly because the telecom industry had its own trajectory, which at that point I didn't realize that it was far more slower than industry to get into. AI basically was great for me because it combined the sort of the intellectual bandwidth I sort of have I like to work with, and with a problem statement which was very immediate, meaning that you could see a difference in people, in services, and you could see this, that the learning curve is so dramatic with AI. And to me, it was, like I said, it was nice to find this thing, but perhaps much later in my life, and also not the usual way. So for me, I think Oxford was amazing because Oxford allowed me to sort of experiment. We talked about all of these things. We talked about AI in space and AI in quantum, and most of these are collaborations. So, I mean, obviously, I do not know about AI in space. Nobody does. Yes, I mean, realistically. So what you do typically is that you work with somebody from AI and somebody from space, and then you form a collaboration. And the same thing we're doing with quantum. So we have Professor Stefano, who leads a number of quantum initiatives in Oxford, and I do something with AI, and we get together literally over a cup of coffee, and then we decide, okay, cool, let's do this, and then we launch this, and this is how we build the body of knowledge with that. And that is the critical thing, that you need to build a body of knowledge. You need to understand what is the state of the art. You need to understand where you could apply something, where you could apply something within a reasonable time frame,
Yeah.
and make a difference to somebody. So there's no point looking at something 10 or 15 years to an abstract discussion. Yes, unless you're a policymaker, it's fine. But for realistic people, you're looking at a 5-year window, realistically, 2 to 5 year window. And within that, what do you do? And the complexity of knowledge. So this, I think, was my key strength, but it took a long time for me to articulate that. And again, I think the academic system is very structured. It possibly doesn't fit for somebody like me who is perhaps very interdisciplinary in nature. And I've already also talked about my personal things like being an autism spectrum and stuff like that as well. So I've also talked about sort of my own personal challenges, which again I realized much later on in my life, and that was quite useful to understand that you can't be something you cannot be, but perhaps there is something you are good at. And I know you do some coaching and stuff like that, and that's a sort of philosophy which almost any coach would tell you, that it is better to do
Sure.
what you are really, as opposed to
Yeah.
trying to fit in. That's the sort of long answer to my question. Cool.
No, that's very interesting, and I think makes a lot of sense, Ajit. I think one of the thoughts which comes to my mind is that, given the work that you do, which is so diverse in nature, be it across geographies, domains, sectors, what is it that inspires you every morning to get up? And like you said, these conversations that you have are
Yeah,
very exploratory in nature. There isn't a structure to it. So just tell me a little bit more. I'm trying to dive into, with
sure,
wearing that
sure,
coach hat.
sure, sure. So there is actually a structure behind it, and that for me that structure is AI. Correct. So when I say AI, I mean machine learning, deep learning, and the evolution of those algorithms as they're going along. Yes, we're talking about the generative algorithms, we're talking about DALI, stable diffusion, all that type of stuff which has been coming along, reinforcement learning, that type of thing. So for me, that's the main intellectual foundation within there. And I do not really deviate much from that, meaning that I don't do blockchain, for example. Yes, I don't do, if somebody comes and says that there is something, yeah, I mean, blockchain is a good example. It's a parallel world. It's interesting. There are a lot of people doing that, but I wouldn't go anywhere near that because I think that there is too many kind of experts, even within AI. And we've talked about this subject before, AI and ethics. I think that's a serious subject now. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not I can talk about my view on AI ethics, but there is a very serious body of researchers and knowledge and coming along. And for me, there is a touch point in my work. So responsible AI. I mean that's great because responsible AI is a framework. It allows you can apply to particular problem. We are applying it to digital twins, for example. But I wouldn't call myself an expert on AI ethics. So that's the first part, which is the sort of what is the commonality. What was the second question? What was the second part of your question?
What is the
How,
inspiration behind that?
inspiration? Yeah,
Yeah.
inspiration behind that. Yes. So to me, the inspiration behind that is quite interesting, and I think that it's something I mentioned to one of my colleagues, and the first time I took her to Oxford, and we were sitting in this cafe called Taylor's, which is a very well-known Oxford cafe. It's a sort of a Oxford. It's a typical. It exists only in Oxford. This particular cafe. It's got a blue kind of logo and stuff like this. And we were sitting in this cafe, and the couple next to us, a guy and a woman, they were quite young, both of them, and they were on about Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's
Okay.
cat is a quantum mechanics concept. I mean, there's a book about In Search of Schrodinger's cat and stuff like that. But that's a very specific physics-based quantum thing. And I mentioned to my colleague who had come to Oxford for the first time, I told her, look, welcome to Oxford, because normal couples talk about normal cats. And this guy and this woman, and there they are talking about this, and they are on and on. It's not like the one-way conversation. The woman's very interactive into that as well. And I point about that story is that intellectual conversations which makes a big difference, and that's what drives a lot of my work and my thinking, because I think that this was the difference in a traditional job which I was doing, was that you really do not have the latitude to think beyond what is directly in front of you. And to a certain extent that is needed because you have a very specific problem to solve. But most people do not really have the latitude to think far beyond their sort of what they could do. In my view, they want to, but they cannot, because they have a job to do, so to speak. So for me, sort of most of my work comes along from my sort of teaching / research in Oxford, but also working with clients who are also in the same sort of space, meaning that most people who work with me from a advisory or consulting perspective do not work with me with something they can easily develop through a traditional IT company. So they're looking at
Right.
so if you are looking at a problem which could be solved by traditional Accenture or TCS or something like that,
Mhm.
that's fine. That's something typically I might get involved into it or not. But the real thing what they look for is something which isn't exactly defined or fits into any traditional pattern. And that's the sort of advice, that's the sort of level I work with very senior people in that way. But it is the same thing, it's a manifestation of the same thing, because Oxford and that type of thinking allows you to think in a very deeper way, in a much more agnostic way. So if you ask a traditional company, they would all obviously have their product, and therefore their thinking or their advice is limited to what their product is. In my view, I think that I think about it from a very different perspective. So if you think about systems thinking and all of those sort of disciplines which go along with that,
Yeah.
and that I think is a big motivation for me. I think that it's something I like to do, and it inspires me and makes you think. But it is two-sided, meaning that I'm saying that there is a structure in what I do in terms
Mhm.
of AI, and within that there is these other areas I tend to apply them, and they are quite interdisciplinary, and that's inspiring.
No, that sounds very interesting. And I think the point you made earlier, Ajit, about the fact that you're playing to your strengths, knowing
Yep.
yourself and playing to your strengths, and that is coming across very strongly. And I think the other aspect that you brought about, I think, is that it gives you the latitude to look at a lot more innovative thinking and working rather than your cookie cutter sort of
Mhm,
roles,
mhm.
which may not give you that kind of latitude with innovation. I remember you'd written a book on innovation some time back. And if you were today to write a playbook on, innovation, looking at digital transformation as the lens, looking at AI's role in digital transformation as the lens, what would be some of the key sort of, insights and recommendations that you would have?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So firstly, that book was written a very long time ago, and it's interesting you found that somewhere. So that's interesting, yeah. But it also takes the idea is still the same in a way, that because you need to think about it from outside in. Correct. You need to think about a problem in general. So if I were to break down the word AI today, correct?
Yeah.
The AI has basically the simplest way I explain AI is through understanding of rules. Yes.
Mhm.
So in a traditional coding or a software development world, you would define your rules and you hard code essentially your rules, correct? So you have your if then else statements, your for loops and stuff
Mm.
like that.
Mm.
However, when the logic changes, then
Mhm.
your code also is brittle and has also to change. So if you then look at learning the rules from the data, then that's where
Mhm.
you look at machine learning. Correct. So you have a
Yeah.
traditional data set.
Mhm.
From
Mhm.
there, you learn the patterns, whether it's predicting house prices or stock prices or classifying something, so on. So, but you're trying to infer the rules from the data, correct? And then you do the deep learning world, which is you're trying to infer both the rules and the structure from the data, whether it's a cat or a dog, without trying to explain the structure of the features of the problem. So this is how
Mhm.
you define deep learning. And then there is AI, which at the moment is defined on traditional deep learning algorithms, but in the future is going to deviate perhaps quite a bit. And especially if you look at AI in terms of generative AI, which is
Mhm.
getting a lot of attention over, we're seeing that a whole new sort of a branch of AI has come through. So the first point is that the rate of change for AI at the research level is very high. No, I don't think there is any other field at the moment which is so moving so fast in
Mhm.
terms of the sheer amount of new breakthroughs it is
Mhm.
coming through in a very short time. So you don't see this chemical engineering, you don't see mechanical engineering, that type of stuff.
Mhm.
But the question then is more structured. So there is a question of where the research of AI is going
Mhm.
and how it applies to an organization. And that's where the
Right.
digital transformation piece comes through.
Mhm.
So the trajectory and the rate of change in an organization is far more defined. Correct. So there
Right.
is the fact that there is something going on doesn't mean that you actually have to apply it today in your organization, because
Mhm.
your value proposition then ties to a much shorter sort of immediate problem, what your problems
Mm.
you have, and so on and so forth, unless you see a direct synergy between something which is in the research space and something you can apply now to solve a very big problem.
Right.
If you do not see that, then the rate of change of an enterprise is much more structured,
Mm.
and therefore the word digital transformation as applied to an organization tends to be far more uh, I mean, the word is a little bit different, because for me
Mm.
everything is digital most of the
Mm.
cases, but
Yeah.
but for many organizations it is not, because they come through, you look at your processes, you look at what happens, and so on and so forth. When you look at it from that perspective, then I think there are other limitations within an organization which have to be also taken into consideration. So there is a trajectory of AI. So you need to understand what AI can do today and what AI is going to be able
Mm.
to do in the
Mm.
next 4 or 5 years. And then there is what is your organization problem, and what can your organization actually, how much change can it actually ingest in
Right.
terms
Yeah.
of actually transforming something. And the reality is that if you look at most large organizations, they run through a typical ERP system, correct? So if you have
Yeah.
a SAP, if you have an Oracle Financials, something like that, and those systems have a certain window of working. So there is the whole organization is geared towards that and things like this, and the rate of change of those systems is relatively slower than the rate of change of what you see in AI.
Mhm.
And this
Yep.
is where I think the question is. So it's a systems problem. It's a
Yeah.
systems implementation problem. Um, and then that's where I think you actually need somebody who is also on the inside of
Mhm.
the organization. So
Right.
who takes a pragmatic view of what is possible, and who understands what is outside, what is inside, and what can reasonably be done within the organization to make a change which is doable. So you don't want to completely change. And I actually was involved in the ERP
Mm.
business for a while, and
Mm.
therefore in the early days of ERP there actually were organizations which have gone bust by implementing a particular ERP platform. I'm not talking which one, but the point is that you
Sure.
had
Yeah.
such a lot of change in such a short time that
Mm.
people actually couldn't cope with it. So
Right.
this is the sort of the thing, because all your systems changed at the same time, and suddenly your customers were affected, or your suppliers were affected, and suddenly the business it became a bottleneck. So there is the rate of change of what is possible. So that's my long answer to the sort of AI question within.